Welcome. Welcome to the Gandel Hall of the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to their elders past and present. Welcome particularly to Canberra. Canberra's, I don't know if you know, Joe, is a monument to what can be achieved by Midwestern idealism matched with Australian leadership. So it's a really great place for us to be hosting this conversation. I want to first of all tell you a little bit about our format and then introduce our speakers and begin. First of all, if you can bring yourself to turn off your phone, I know it's painful, but now's the opportunity. So that's the first thing to let you know. Secondly, we're going to begin with a bit of a conversation between Joe and myself and Chris, talk for as long as it takes us to bore ourselves, I suppose, a bit about growth and inequality, and then try to bring you all in. Then we'll have a bit of an opportunity for a cup of coffee and a handshake, and possibly even a photograph if you're able to turn your phone back on in time. So welcome all. Let me begin by acknowledging Joe, a Nobel laureate, a Professor of Economics at Columbia University. We're tremendously glad to see you here in Australia, carrying the argument, and tremendously glad to see you here at the Chifley Research Centre. It's a real honour you do us with your presence. I know you're in Canberra for a few days and in Australia for only a short time, so we couldn't be happier to have you. Thank you so much. I want to also acknowledge Chris Bowen MP, our Shadow Treasurer, carrying the argument for Labor on the economic side, doing a great job at a really difficult time. But here we are in the first year of opposition, and the budget's probably made our job a little bit easier, but it doesn't do it for us. So someone's got to carry the case. So thanks for being here with us, Chris. And Chris is quite engaged with our work and does some terrific things. So we're really grateful for your continued engagement. Should acknowledge Senator Penny Wong, good friend, Jenny Macklin MP. Tim Watts MP, really glad to have you here. Should also make a special acknowledgement of Australia's crumbling transport infrastructure, which has delayed former Deputy Prime Minister and Treasurer Wayne Swan, who'll be here. He's got a seat. Jenny's holding the spot for him, so we're looking forward to seeing Wayne shortly. And I know he's looking forward to being here. Should also acknowledge our Chifley Chair, Nick Martin, and members of our board, and all of you friends and guests of the Chifley Research Centre. So look, thank you so much for being here, Joe, and welcome. I was hoping you could begin by telling me about Gary, Indiana.
So the reason he's mentioned Gary, Indiana is that's where I grew up. I was born and grew up. And in a way, Gary, Indiana is really interesting because it reflects the rise and fall of the industrial sector in the United States. It's a steel town on the southern shore of Lake Michigan, in the Midwest. It was founded in 1906 by U.S. Steel as the largest integrated steel mill in the world. It was named after, and there aren't many cities that have this distinction, named after the chairman of the board of U.S. Steel. And it was totally a company town. As a company town in the early part of the 20th century, it did some things right. It started with a very good school system that was very much influenced by John Dewey and his ideas called work, study, play. We all had to learn 2 crafts because the assumption was that everybody had to have skills. So I learned how to be a printer. My brother learned how to be a metal worker. So it was a very industrial city. I said it reflected the rise and fall of manufacturing. I was there. I grew up I was born in '43, so I grew up in the late '40s, '50s there, and that was the peak. Population was around 200,000. It's about 30, 40 miles from Chicago, and any of you who would drive from the East Coast to Chicago would go by Gary, because you had to go by Gary, and you got a wonderful display of the aurora borealis, the northern lights. except it wasn't the aurora borealis, it was pollution from the steel mill going into the air. And I hate to look at my lungs to see when I die what they look like, because they must be coated with soot and dirt. It was, you're not only the largest steel producer, it's probably the largest polluter in the world. And, just poured out iron ore and everything. But anyway, Gary is now, when I go back to visit, it doesn't pollute as much. You can say that's because it's no longer producing. But it's actually not true. It produces as much steel as it did at its peak, but without any workers. With that more accurately, about less than a sixth of the number of workers. The result of that is Gary is a ghost town. And you go back, I did a little film about globalization for the French-German TV called Arte. And it begins in Gary because it was, in a way, illustrates the multiple sides of globalization. So we couldn't really compete with China, except by making mass-produced, low-quality steel. We didn't go the German route of making specialized steel. We made really low-quality steel. Because the United States didn't believe in industrial policies, we said, okay, let the city rot. So if you go there, it looks like a war zone. And in fact, one of the small industries, they were a little bit proud when I went there about this, is they make movies. There have been 2 or 3 movies made there where you want to show the fighting like in Somaliland, and it's too dangerous to go to Somali, but you want to see what a war zone looks like. Gary looks like a war zone. So they make war movies there because it looks totally destroyed. I hope I give you a picture of how bad things are.
You're saying dystopia is a future growth industry.
Yeah. So the one part, our neighboring town, one part of the steel industry, a small part, not Gary, but the next town, East Chicago, was saved because the steel mill was bought by Mittal, which is an Indian steel producer. So globalization destroyeth and it also saveth. So it saved a small part of the industry by buying it. You would have thought that America enterprise would be able to figure out a way to save the steel industry, but the answer was no, because our industry was more concentrated on how to extract as much profits for the shareholders as quickly as possible, and for the CEOs even more quickly, and not reinvest in the country. So we had a steel industry that did not reinvest, and so the city was left basically to die, not to be reinvented. And any of you followed what's been happening to Detroit, there's some wonderful pictures that have been on the news about what happens to a major American metropolis, 1 million people, when you let it go to seed. The one thing is that there is an inkling of the beginning of a revival in Detroit, because you can buy a home that would have been $1 million for $10,000. So there's a lot of poor people, a lot of artists who've decided that that they are poor, but the people who say, well, it doesn't matter where I live, I can buy a nice house for $10,000, and they've moved to Detroit. So it was the beginning of a little, when you really hit bottom, you can...
some way back.
Yeah, but the real thing about Gary is that it illustrates what happens in the absence of industrial policies. And when I say industrial, I mean policies to try to restructure the economy, an enormous cost to society. Now, my own growing up in Gary had a lot of influence on me in a number of ways, because as I was growing up, you could see there a lot of African Americans, we had very bad discrimination, a lot of poverty, really serious poverty, episodic unemployment. Business cycle was in its heyday, going up and down. And it had a lot of influence on me, I think, because when I went to graduate school and I studied these economics textbooks that said how wonderful the market economy was, and there were people like Gary Becker, I don't know if you know, who said that markets make sure that discrimination didn't exist. I became convinced that these guys were totally out of touch with reality. And that, as I put it in one of my lectures, you know, the result that they proved that the market was efficient and this was the best of all possible worlds. My reaction is, this was the best possible world. I wanted to live in another world. And the view that another world was possible, and that's what I've been working on since.
Chris, you're from another world, as it were, also a crossroads of globalisation, and you came to maturity in the period of huge economic and social change in Sydney's west. Could you tell us about that? And it's obviously a different story, but a related story in a way.
Yeah, so I grew up and still live in Smithfield, which is named after Smithfield, London, because it was the market town of early Sydney. And I guess in a lesson about what government decisions can mean for places, Smithfield was the centre of Western Sydney, and then a decision was taken to send the railway line to Parramatta, not Smithfield, and the rest is history. People here have heard of Parramatta, they've not heard, even Joseph might have heard of Parramatta, but he hasn't heard of Smithfield, I'm quite sure. But it has led to a very different community. It is arguably, depending on how you use your metrics, the most multicultural community in Australia. In my electorate, 51% of people born overseas and speak and very high proportion speak a language other than English at home. And we have the largest industrial estate in the Southern Hemisphere, Smithfield Wetherill Park, the largest industrial conglomeration in the Southern Hemisphere. Yet we still have very high unemployment, and particularly high youth unemployment. Always have. Had higher youth unemployment than the national average. We sit, I live literally 100 metres from a factory, which is the start of the Smithfield Wetherill Park industrial conglomeration. So there's a huge disconnect, which is partly related to our multicultural makeup and the difficulty in attaching migrants to skills and jobs, and refugees in particular, very high refugee intake in my community to skills and jobs, but a high degree of services as well, and 24-hour operation. I mean, if I get woken up in the middle of the night, it's not the kids usually, it's the sirens going at the factories signalling shift change. That's the environment I grew up. My dad worked for the NRMA, which is also based in that industrial estate, which is for non-New South Wales people, the Automobile Club for New South Wales, the mechanics. He was permanent midnight shift, so he would work 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. every day at the NRMA, making, of course, people's cars break down in the middle of the night as well. So he would come home at 7 as I was getting ready for school. He'd have a scotch to get himself off to sleep. The smell of scotch and milk, as I had my Weet-Bix, stays with you for the rest of your life. That's how he relaxed as he came home in the morning, because he needed to get to sleep through all the noise of the day going on around him, so he could be ready to go back to work at 11 o'clock at night. But our industrial estate has obviously got its huge challenges, but there is a fair degree of innovation, a lot of high-tech jobs, and people talk about high-tech manufacturing, but it's not making high-tech things necessarily. It's doing things in a high-tech way, and that has its pluses and its minuses, as I think Joseph was implying, that obviously it means the factories are still there, but the number of people employed with them has fallen dramatically, and I suppose we might get onto that, but you know, I wonder whether this is the start of what Jared Bernstein calls the jaws of the snake, where productivity for the first time is going up, but employment's not going up with it, and what public policy challenges that provides for us all.
So I'm hearing in a way you're both talking about places where growth has been a key determinant, but at the same time growth hasn't been enough. Like, the growth is necessary, but obviously not sufficient. But just before we get further into that, what else there is apart from growth, I'm interested in hearing a bit from you both about prospects for growth in coming years. there's some barriers and some policies that we need to pursue, but clearly part of the story of the last 5 or 10 years has been this sledgehammer to economic growth first. What is it getting any better? Is there any cause for optimism?
I think you need to think about these on two sides, the demand side and the supply side, the demand side and the productivity side. And so the main problem since the 2008 crisis, and even before, I would argue, has to do with the demand side. It's really an old-fashioned Keynesian problem of lack of aggregate demand in most countries around the world. China is very different, and you've been benefiting from the spillovers from China, but in, called the North Atlantic, Europe and the United States, real problems of lack of aggregate demand, leading to, most of the European countries today have a per capita income adjusted for inflation lower than it was 2008. And it's been a lost half decade, and it looks like it'll probably be 5 years before they get back to where they were, let alone no prospect of catching up where they would have been but for the crisis. So just getting back to, and even Germany, which claims to be a success story, has grown on a per capita adjusted for inflation basis of under 1%, which you would normally say is a D- performance. And the bottom 30% of Germany has seen a decline. So you got to say this is really not very good. Just to give you one number to show you how bad American economy, because America thinks of itself as doing better than Europe, median income in the United States, median household income, half above, half below, in the United States is now lower than it was a quarter century ago. And median income, if you look at various groups, we're talking about industrialization, median income of a full-time male worker in the United States is lower than it was 40 years ago. Minimum wage, people at the bottom have wages basically lower than they were a half century ago. So this is a, sort of, if you want a picture of how the market economy, in quote, the best performing economy in the world is working. It's not working for most people. Bill Gates is doing very well, by the way, but that's it's nice to know that somebody's doing well, and the people who engage, the guy who owns the gambling casinos in Macau is doing very well, and so there's some places people are doing well, but in terms of most Americans, the American economy has not been performing, and not likely to begin performing for some time. Now, that's important to realize because a lot of the debate is in other countries is how to make their economy like America. And I think it really is important to understand that for most people, the American economy hasn't been working. And so you want to try to understand why has the American economy been failing and make sure that you don't make the same mistakes that the United States has made.
Well, it feels like we're starting to enter a phase like that, or entering now a phase like that in Australian politics and debate, where there is this pressure to pursue approaches which, as you say, look to have failed. We've obviously had relatively speaking, a good crisis, as it were, a good 5 years, 6 years. But as Chris can probably say, we're now entering a period of risk, both on the demand side and through policy.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why I think it's important, there's this ideology that markets are the way to deliver. And the more unfettered the market, the better. And I think it's important to remember, America had pretty unfettered markets, and this is what it's delivered for most people. And the answer is it really hasn't delivered.
So, Chris, it strikes me this argument that Joe's making with a fair bit of force is obviously a really sharp challenge to call it American capitalism. But I suppose we probably feel like we've got a different model here, at least in part. To what extent do you think it's a challenge to the way we've done business in Australia? We're hearing a critique of liberal markets which can be positioned in different ways depending on whether it's applied to the Australian model, the American model and others. How much do we have to learn from this, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think obviously the context is different, but the principles are the same around the world, or around the developed capitalist world. In Australia, I would have thought, We have some things to point to as being achievements and some things to be worried about for the future. So has inequality increased in Australia? Yes. Do we have the most targeted, most effective welfare system in the world? I would say yes, probably. The fact that we can have a relatively low tax base and yet have a welfare system which is we're the means testing capital of the world. Personally, I think that's appropriate because it means that we are focusing our redistributive efforts in quite a targeted fashion. And of course, importantly, our industrial relations regime, which has been ever since the Harvester judgment, and it's been obviously pushed and pulled in various directions. But I was fascinated, Joseph, to read the IMF just last week recommend an increase in the minimum wage in the United States, which I thought was a very, I mean, those well-known socialists down at the IMF saying that the minimum wage should be boosted to try and boost consumption. And I thought, well, that's probably quite a dramatic development in the scale of this debate that you're referring to, Michael, and reflects. We have our minimum wage arguments in Australia too, but they're nowhere near as fraught as those in the United States because we have had the minimum wage more or less keep up compared to the United States. In fact, the IMF felt obliged to enter into that debate and say we need to stimulate demand, and okay, that's one thing to say, but we should stimulate demand by giving people more money in their wages. I thought was quite a dramatic development in this debate.
Yeah, let me just emphasize that there's been a real major change in economic thinking on these issues. The IMF has been very strong, very effective in pointing out, in a way that I pointed out also in my book, The Price of Inequality, that today inequality is a major impediment to economic growth, economic efficiency, economic stability. And the IMF has taken up the call to try to say, and I've heard Christine Lagarde talking China, talk in the United States, you really have to reduce these extremes of inequality. So, so this is based on the best economic research, and it's very difficult for somebody in the opposition to say, I mean somebody in the government, current government, but to say really inequality is a good thing, or that if you push an equality agenda, it would hamper economic growth. That used to be we thought of there being a trade-off, and now very strong view that there are a wide set of instruments by which we could increase equality and increase economic growth, including increasing minimum wage. Australia's minimum wage played a important role in the U.S. debate because our minimum wage is half that of Australia. And to say that, high minimum wages mean you're going to have high unemployment, we say, look at Australia. Why can they have a minimum wage that's twice that of the United States, and we can't? And that's been an important part of the argument. And you really set a good example there, as in several other areas. But before you get too complacent, you should, in terms of your after-tax and transfer measure of inequality, a standard measure of Gini coefficient, it's about twice that of Denmark. There's a lot of room for improvement. I mean, I don't think that Australia should feel that it's really doing well. You're doing better than the United States. You could be doing worse. But that's not a benchmark. I don't think you should set the United States as your benchmark. I think you really should set the Scandinavian countries, which in terms of most measures of societal well-being have been doing so much better in terms of growth, and at the same time have been able to reduce inequality. Enormously.
So a D minus isn't really the goal.
Yeah.
We don't want to just do better than a D minus.
And there's one other aspect that's important, an important aspect of that's, I think is probably much stronger in Australia than the United States, but important to keep and again is under threat right now, which is equality of opportunity. We've talked about equality of outcomes and the numbers, the income inequality, wealth inequality. One of the ways, you know, U.S. has the highest level of income inequality. The level of wealth inequality is even worse. The top 1% has about 30 to 40% of all the wealth. And that's, health inequality in the United States is probably the worst of the advanced countries. And that's because we have a private-based healthcare system. And Australia has a reputation of both having a good healthcare system, relatively quality, and low cost. We spend, I think, twice what you do with outcomes that are comparable to a developing country. So if you want to get a system where rent-seeking plays a large role in the healthcare sector, move towards the American system where you'll get lower outcomes with spending more money. And some of the discussion going on here seems to be a desire by some people to move in that direction. And if you're one of the rent seekers, I totally understand that. But why the rest of society should support this kind of rent-seeking behavior, I don't understand. But one of the most disturbing aspect of American inequality is the lack of equality of opportunity.
I was just going to say, this is an interesting point which we've been talking a bit about with Jenny Macklin, and I might want to bring Jenny in on this point about the modernisation of redistributive systems, social insurance, and for that matter, pre-distribution, education and so on, whether we've kept pace with the pace of economic change on the market side in Australia since the 1980s, whether there's a modernisation challenge there. Now I'm just going to ask, where's our roving mic?
Okay, while you're getting that, let me just mention the fact the United States, you know, likes to think of itself as the American dream. And we now know it's a myth, that the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in other advanced countries. And it's mainly because of education system. And one of your important parts of this is your way of financing higher education, for which Bruce Chapman over there was an important contributor in income contingent loans. Really important, and that things are getting worse in the United States, not better.
So we've had innovations in health and education, but I just want to bring Jenny in on this particular point about innovations in the sort of welfare and other payment side.
Thanks very much, and thanks for joining us here today. I just wanted to join together the comment you made about your hometown and the cost of its demise. And some of the other points you've been making in your writing about how to actually measure the social and economic costs of these huge changes. So in Australia, just today, it's the first anniversary of a huge reform we put in place, the new National Disability Insurance Scheme, a new system of insurance to cover people with severe disabilities over their lifetimes. And when we had the Productivity Commission do the inquiry into how this scheme should work, they did some analysis for us of the economic benefits of such an insurance approach. But what we've always found very difficult to measure, and particularly difficult to get agreement about with traditional economic thinking, maybe if I could put it that way, is how to actually demonstrate the social and economic benefit of such investments. I think we've failed for the sort of town or city that you came from, but we also are unable to describe the benefit to society other than in the broadest terms. And so the current neoliberal approach is, well, this is going to cost us $14 billion. That's a cost to society. And we don't have a very effective way of coming back and saying, well, these, in fact, are the economic benefits. What would be your advice about how to better pursue that argument?
Okay, so part of the way I would begin the discussion is to first note that GDP is not a good measure of economic performance. And and this is now well accepted. I chaired this International Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. We have a report called Mismeasuring Our Lives, Why GDP Doesn't Add Up. And there was unanimity that GDP, not only GDP was not a good measure, but what were the things that were wrong, setting a research agenda that's now been taken up by the OECD. And there's now a high-level expert group, which I chair, that is trying to push this agenda further. If we could get more financial support, we'd be able to do it more. But there are many aspects of why GDP is not a good measure. It doesn't measure what happens to resource depletion. If your growth is based on taking wealth away from under the ground and you don't reinvest it above the ground, you're poor. So it doesn't measure economic sustainability. It doesn't measure, it doesn't, so there are lots of things that are not incorporated. One thing that it doesn't measure that is very important is security. And lots of studies illustrate how important security is. At the World Bank, we did a study when I was chief economist on the voices of the poor, where we talked about what was it that made people suffer the most of being at the bottom. And obviously, lack of income was important, but so was insecurity and lack of voice. Those were the three things that kept coming up. We interviewed 10,000 people, kept coming up over and over again. Now, the good thing is that's one aspect that we know how to quantify well. We know how to quantify the cost of insecurity. And so one of the things that we're trying to do, part of the agenda going forward, is to include measures of insecurity as a real economic benefit. I mean, after all, you think of the whole insurance industry, what is that whole industry about? It's a measure of the people are willing to spend lots of money to inefficient private insurance companies to get more security. So there's no doubt that people value security. We can actually quantify how much they value. The fact that when we provide it publicly, we don't incorporate that benefit in GDP is a mistake of our measurement system. It's not, if we don't measure it, doesn't mean it's not there. It's a real benefit. And I think we ought to be using, trying to move towards expanded metrics of well-being, which would include the value of security. And so, for instance, my view is when we try to privatize old age pension in the United States, to leave people on the, dependent on the market, that was increasing insecurity, and that was a lowering of standards of living. And we were grateful that Bush failed. Had he succeeded, the crisis of 2009-8 would have been much worse because people's total retirement income would have been wiped out. And the number of people in poverty in the United States would have soared. Everybody over 65 would have been put into poverty if we had privatized Social Security in the way that Bush had wanted.
So there's a personal level of economic security at stake in some of those changes, and there's also a system-wide stability, a sort of a cost to. So what we're hearing in this kind of, even if it is growing, it's unbalanced growth. We're getting both individuals are feeling the lack of security, and then there's a kind of a globalised or national or countrywide instability. This might be a point I'd be interested in bringing you in on, Wayne, is what I think you've spoken to us about a bit at Chifley is an inclusive growth agenda, which obviously has these benefits of delivering income to individuals, but also I'd be interested in your thoughts of whether inclusive growth is going to be actually more secure for those individuals and more stable.
Well, I think the thing that really stands out to me, particularly as I've been talking to people internationally about this debate in Australia, and what's really different here, say from the United States or Great Britain for that matter, I think, is industrial relations. And if you talk about security, there's nothing more fundamental than A, getting a job, and then B, having the capacity to keep that job under decent working conditions. And whilst it's true that we've done very well in terms of universal health and education as a driver of long-term social mobility, what really stands out to me is that we've kept the gains in our economic growth largely with the middle and lower income earners over the last few years. Yes, there's been a concentration at the top, but amongst lower and middle income earners, most of our growth has been spread pretty evenly across them. And the factor that distinguishes us, say, from elsewhere in the world is not just the number of jobs created during a difficult period, but the fact that the benefit of that has been shared pretty widely, I think, through a decent minimum wage and also through good collective bargaining arrangements. And that's why I think this debate internationally is missing something. The Brits are concentrating particularly on opportunities in health and education and regulating power prices and issues like that. But I think what's missing there, and perhaps missing in the wider debate around the world, is collective bargaining power and a decent minimum wage. And I've got to say, I'm really surprised when I go to conferences with bankers and they're talking about, you know, problems in terms of demand for credit. Even bankers are standing up and saying, well, what do you expect if millions of people are on a wage that's so low they don't have the capacity to buy a house? So I think from what's going on in Australia, the thing that really stands out, apart from the obvious things, is our industrial relations system, which we've been able to hold in place. And I guess that explains why there's such a backlash against it and why vested interests here. Their number one aim isn't just to dismantle universal and quality health and education, it's to rip out the industrial relations system.
Can I just add one other thing? I agree very strongly with that. I've engaged in a lot of discussions with the Scandinavian countries where unions are much stronger than they are even in Australia. And the Scandinavian countries have been very innovative, very dynamic. And part of the story that they believe, at least many of the economists in the Scandinavian countries believe, of their success is strong industrial protection, strong unions, and strong social systems of social protection. And there are two ways that it has, they believe, benefited their growth. So it's been a pro-growth, and it's not just social protection. At least two or three ways that it has benefited their economy. One of them is actually that the effect of these policies has been what you call wage compression, moving wages at the bottom up. And that's incentivized companies to become more productive, to try to think about how they use labor more efficiently. So it's actually, you know, we were talking about productivity. These policies are pro-productivity policies. They motivate firms to think about ways of using labor more efficiently. And so there's a positive productivity cycle. The second thing is that when you have better systems of social protection, people can undertake better risks. And innovation is risky. But if you have good systems of social protection, you know that if you lose, you're still part of an economy in which even the bottom does reasonably well. So that really encourages more risk-taking. And finally, I don't know, some of you may have seen some of the debate that some of my remarks made instigated on where the government spokesman said that investing in poor people was a waste of money. And it was really quite astounding statement. I view it as an investment, you know, that money goes, and the worst problem is poverty, childhood poverty. And if children grow up in poverty, they're likely to be less productive in the future. And therefore, your growth is going to be weaker. And if you don't have adequate nutrition, adequate health, but also adequate income, it just affects the whole generational productivity of society. So I view those investments those welfare expenditures, which, as you say, are targeted, but they're not living off the hog. I mean, you look at the standard of living they're getting. It's not. No one chooses to be at that bottom because of the welfare benefits that they're getting. I think it's an important part of investment in society.
You might have trouble convincing some in the public debate of that last point. I don't disagree. I'm keen to bring Penny in on this, in a sense, in whatever you'd like to say, but I was interested either on, you've talked a bit about G versus R and the pressure to get G up rather than to get R down. That might be one place to go. The other is the longer term fiscal picture for all of this too. I know you'd happily relieved of that responsibility.
What if I wasn't going to ask either of them?
Or you can say whatever you like.
I don't know what the sort of niceties of asking one economist about another economist and asking you about Piketty are. But actually, I wanted to come back to I suppose what is the prescription, or what is the direction? So as you know, certainly in Australia, we have a perennial debate as a reasonably open, medium-sized economy about what are the domestic policy settings that best enhance equality, growth and opportunity, given that we live in a world where there are many market and other globalisation forces beyond our control. And you've spoken in response to Jenny and Wayne about some of the things that you would say should be done. But I wonder if you could amplify that. And the way I was going to ask it is, what would you say? I'm sorry, I don't know how as an Australian to say your hometown.
Gary.
Gary.
Gary. Yeah, it is Gary. Yeah, no, it's all like it sounds. Yeah.
Oh, that was Gary.
No.
Yeah, what would you say what are the industrial policies to which you referred, I think in your very first answer, and or other policies that you would say governments of the sort of centre-left persuasion should be looking at to manage those impacts and to, I suppose, tool our people, enable our people to hook into different opportunities?
Sure. I think there's been, again, a very major change in thinking globally on this issue, just as there has been about inequality. And I mentioned before that it used to be thought that you could only reduce inequality at the expense of growth. Now we realize that those are complements, not substitutes. It's a really major change in thinking, and I think it's an important point to try to get across. Same thing, industrial policy. It used to be viewed that was a no-no. The World Bank and IMF told Korea that their comparative advantage was growing rice, and they ought to stick to their knitting. And Korea said, no thank you. We want to be a prosperous country. We want our people to be prosperous, and just letting the market do it, specializing in rice was not going to do the trick. And so they promoted industrial policies that led to incomes per capita increasing eightfold, Korea being in the OECD, the 12th largest economy in the world. You probably all drive some Korean cars. They're a major chip producer. It really worked. Very, very successful. Now the World Bank has changed its position on this issue. And so from going in opposition to industrial policies, the chief economist of the World Bank over the last 5 years, that was the major thrust, trying to get countries to have industrial policies. The important point to realize is that every country has industrial policies, whether they know it or not. The only difference is some don't know it. And if you don't know it, your industrial policy is prey to special interest and rank seeking. So, for instance, every country has to decide where you're going to build roads. You were talking about your example of a road. Where you build that road is going to affect your town and the other town. Whether you have ports or where you build those ports, how you build the roads. It used to be in Africa, they would build a road that only went to the mine. So the roads and the railroads had minimal developmental impacts. It wasn't inevitable. It was an industrial policy that said, let's design a transportation system that did not impact the rest of the development because we want to keep them as colonies and keep them poor, to keep our labor costs low. It was almost a deliberate. I don't know if they went through that reasoning, but it was almost that bad. In the United States, we had an industrial policy that said, when I use the word industrial policy, what I mean is a policy that pushes some sector of the economy or another. Our bankruptcy law, most countries with, what I would say, reasonable bankruptcy law say if a debtor can't pay all his debts, who has first claim? It's workers, because workers can't get the labor back. You know, there's no collateral. There's no way you can get repaid. They spent their time. They have nothing else to depend, and the rule of law is supposed to protect those who can't fend for themselves. What did the U.S. do? The first claimant are derivatives. The bankers changed the law so that if a company couldn't pay its debt, the first claimant are those risky products that one company, AIG, got $150 billion, more money than we gave to poor people over a decade. So, you know, we have corporate welfare, but not welfare for poor people. So that was an example of an industrial policy. It worked. We got a big financial sector, 8% of GDP. Yeah. So we succeeded. Industrial policy worked, and we deliberately set out to encourage an overbloated financial sector. And when I say we, that is to say the financial sector set out to do it. We weren't aware of this as industrial policy, and we wound up with structuring our economy for creating an unstable financial system. So in my mind, what we should have done, a little bit, UK has done a couple examples of this kind of industrial policy. Norway is an interesting country, you know, very successful in managing its natural resources. One of the few countries with a lot of natural resources that has not suffered from the natural resource curse. It's reinvested the money in its people. The Prime Minister of Norway, a very dynamic woman, told me a meeting last year. She said, you know, now we get more return from our investments in women than we get from oil. Whether it's true or not, it's an important story that no, I mean, she really believed it. And you know, how you actually estimate that is very difficult. Yeah. But it's part of their understanding of what investments can do. And that oil is now not the most important source of their economy. It's investments in people. But they have an active industrial policy to say, how can we take advantage of what our oil industry to support other industries? And they've done that. You know, to have an oil industry, you have to have pumps. But pumps are used all over in lots of other industries. So they become a major producers of pumps for every industry now in the world. So that's an example of industrial policy that is very successful. What the UK did that we should have done in Gary, whether they could have done it or not, I don't know, but take Manchester, which was the textile capital of the world, couldn't compete against Chinese textiles, and they reconverted Manchester into a university city, a city of music, not music that I like, but it's music that has attracted, that makes, it's a big source of revenue. People go there to enjoy that particular kind of music. So these are all examples of restructuring cities that can make them continue to live. It's a huge waste of, you've made these enormous investments in urban infrastructure, and to say, oh, I'm sorry, we're just going to let that decay and rebuild somewhere else is, you know, it may be in some cases that may be the best answer, but in most cases it's probably not.
I want to bring in someone who's possibly got more sympathy for the Manchester sound than you do, Joe. Tim Watts. Tim Watts, I mean, you represent an electorate or a constituency with a big industrial heritage and obvious transition challenges now, and at the same time, your own professional experience in IT and technology gives you a particular outlook there. You know, what we're hearing often is the challenge is that the technology is taking the jobs away and isn't giving them back, maybe not anywhere, certainly not in the communities where they're destroying them. How are you seeing that on the ground in the West?
Well, I should start by saying that I represent an electorate that's just lost 2,500 jobs in our auto manufacturing industry after the government moved away from industrial policy in that respect. So that's a bit of a raw wound for me. But I suppose if I have one question, I should retreat to my area of expertise in technology. And you know, I'm very passionate about technology. I love it. It's one of these industries that, you know, is disrupting industries and disrupting markets around the world. But it does worry me at the same time, because I very much agree with Wayne's comments about the strength of our industrial relations system and driving equality in Australia. But then I looked at the technology sector, and the biggest impact that it's had is in eroding transaction costs. So that the things that unite us, so it's atomised the industries that it's gone through, it's atomised employment in those industries. It's made a lot of industries more contestable to markets for employment and things like that. And I see that, and I worry about the potential for the industrial relations system that has served us so well to protect us in this new atomised employment environment. So I suppose I'd ask you, what kind of prescriptions can you suggest moving into that world? Do you buy that analysis to start with? Secondly, what can we do about it? And thirdly, does that mean we need to be looking more at sort of these pre-distribution type interventions? I mean, I'm particularly interested in intellectual property in this respect as a set of rules that determine who gains from investments in these sectors. Is this something we need to be looking at in this new world?
Yeah. These are really complex questions, but let me first make a couple of observations about the high-tech sector in the United States, and then talk a little bit about some of the specific questions. It is a real worry about whether the high-tech sector will create enough jobs. That I think that while it will create some jobs, there is a real worry about whether it will be enough. Just to give you one example, the largest capitalized firm in the United States today is Apple. But Apple has only 49,000 employees in the entire country, of which all but 19,000 are low-paid retail workers. So they're only not, when I say low-paid, probably lower than your minimum wage or at your minimum wage. So they're really not what we call great jobs. I mean, we say every job is good, but these are not the jobs that will create a middle-class society. So there are only 19,000 that would be categorized. That's not a basis of an economy. You know, an economy with 350 million people. What's particularly disturbing about Apple is that you took advantage, it wouldn't exist without the internet, without modern technology, perfectly willing to take from the technology, the technological investments the government had made, but totally uninterested in paying back. So it used all the ingenuity that it had used to make telephones with nice round corners, brilliant innovations, to avoid paying taxes.
Or to cut corners.
And to cut corners, exactly, to cut corners. Didn't do anything illegal. They have very good lawyers to make sure they don't go to prison, but taking advantage of every loophole in every country. So they claim that all this profits originated in a few hundred people in Ireland, and that they then happened to be able to take advantage of a loophole in Irish tax law, so they didn't even have to pay taxes in Ireland. So, I mean, I think it's a really moral scandal, and went on to recognize that. And I think it's important for the G20 to try to take strong actions to stop this race to the bottom, and the companies that are willing to take out, not to put back. The second point is from a global technology point of view. I mean, you look at where America has been most successful in technology, besides Apple, which has been, you know, Google, Facebook. What are the business models that they're based on? Advertising. We've created the most efficient advertising agencies in the world, and they've become the largest firms in the world. But you cannot have an economy that just advertises other people's products. You know, it's nice to have efficient advertising so that when you're driving, they can recognize your car and tell you what you ought to be buying. Or that when you walk by a store, your phone tells you, go in there and buy something. But the bottom line is, all this advertising doesn't increase productivity, doesn't even increase spending. It only says I spend more on this guy rather than that guy. Your spending is going to be limited to your income. So it's all, I don't want to say socially wasteful, but it's not really socially productive. So we have to understand that the innovation in our economy in the United States, for the most part, has not been really increasing our standard of living. It's been creating more, hard to know where you create social media in terms of standard of living, but not making things like better solar panels or new products that would change. Third thing, we're going through a structural transformation that's analogous to the transformation that we went through 100 years ago. 100 years ago, 70% of the people were in agriculture. 70% of people were in agriculture. Today, only 2%, 3% in the United States are in agriculture, and they produce more food than even an obese society can consume. And then we had to move from agriculture to manufacturing. Markets don't do that very well, for a very good reason, that the people in those sectors see the value of their assets disappear. So they can't make the investments they need to move to the new sectors. And so they get trapped in the old sectors. And we're a little bit in that same situation, manufacturing. We're now moving from manufacturing to a service sector. People in the manufacturing with those skills are trapped and they can't go on to the new sectors. Now, the only thing that really facilitated that movement from agriculture to manufacturing was government. In the United States, it was the war, the GI Bill that educated everybody for the manufacturing economy, that moved the US from a rural economy to a manufacturing economy. Without the government, it would not have happened. It was a kind of industrial policy. And now we're going to have to go from industrial manufacturing to a service sector. This relates to the question of productivity. Globally, we've been very successful in manufacturing, just like we were in agriculture. Output of manufacturing continues to go up, but globally, employment is going down. And advanced countries like the United States, Australia, are going to get, inevitably, even if they're the most efficient, are going to get a smaller share of that global employment. And so employment in manufacturing will go down. And then have to ask the question, where do you want to go? It can go down faster if you don't do the right policies. But the question is to try to have a smooth transition. Now, to give you an example, the United States saved the automobile industry. We're celebrating that. But we saved it in a way that converted what were good paying jobs, paying $45 an hour, to pay the wages now in the automobile industry are $15 an hour, are equivalent to your minimum wage jobs. We could have transformed the industry in some other ways to make it high tech, but we didn't do that. So the bottom line is that the new jobs are almost surely going to be in service sector. I mean, you have a huge demand for education, not only for Australians, but for Chinese and Indians, for health, there are lots of these service sector jobs that are not just domestic, which are export potential.
I just want to bring in a particular question. I was struck, you just mentioned the war and the GI Bill. I'm struck that the war had that kind of almost practical impact, all those policies that arose from it, but it created a really powerful moral collectivism in a society that saw the benefits of working together to do something amazing and important, and then thought, well, that's something we can do for other things. And that's, you know, kind of faded. It's clearly faded in a different, you know, and it had lots of costs, of course. That, you know, popular moral culture of the 1950s has downsides as well. But there's this very strong moral unity almost, in a sense that unity and collective action works and is not just technically sound, but is a good. And a lot of what we've been talking about here kind of circles around the relationship between the politics and the economics. You know, we're hearing some of the bad economic policies didn't arise because of technical misunderstandings, they arose because of deliberate policy. So just with that connection in mind, I wanted to bring in a particular question from Simon Quinn from Sydney, who's speaking of the disruptive effects of technology as a supporter of the Chifley Research Centre, who was able to email in a question and won a contest to ask you a question on behalf of our thousands of supporters. So Simon, you had a question which I think relates to some of this.
Yes, I do. Although when I received that call, I thought somebody must have a better question than me. But, so be kind to me. Australia is a technological country. We have a stable political environment, regardless of who's in power. We have an educated workforce and abundant natural resources. In that context, my question was, why does poverty exist? But having listened to you, perhaps the better question would be, will we ever eliminate poverty?
Okay, well, there are, partly this is a definitional question. I mean, because you can go back to the Bible, the poor you always will have with you, but there's a definitional question. There's always going to be somebody at the bottom. There's always going to be some inequality. We're never going to eliminate inequality, and that's not, one shouldn't confuse what I said, that we have too extreme inequality, with the statement that we want complete equality. The two are very different statements, that we have really extreme inequality. The same thing, if you ask, will we always have somebody who has an income, say, less than half the median? You always, almost surely will. But you don't have to have people who are living in deprivation. And that's the difference. You know, to try to say, and deprivation is going to be a relative concept, but there is within any society a sense of what are our basic standards. No one has to go without health care. No child should, you know, nobody should go without adequate nutrition. Probably without some level of adequate housing. You know, what that level is will probably, if you become wealthier, that minimum standard may go up. There's still going to be, you know, you might not want to live in the kind of housing you provide at the bottom, but there should be nobody who is really suffering from extreme deprivation in our society. Where I think progressives ought to particularly focus on, though, is childhood deprivation. Because you might say, you know, if somebody decides they don't want to work, they want to, you know, be a ski bum, or that's their decision. But children don't choose their parents. In the United States, almost 1 out of 4 children live in families in poverty. That shouldn't exist in a well-off country. And you were describing the characteristics of Australia. One of the most disturbing things about natural resource-rich countries, you probably heard of the paradox of the natural resource curse, that countries with a lot of resources typically don't grow as fast, and you're an exception, and Norway are exceptions. It's also the case that you would have thought that countries with a lot of natural resources should have more equality, or should have no poverty. Because after all, who owns the natural resources? The people do. And if you tax savings and labor, people might not save as much, might not work as much. If you tax iron ore or oil, the iron ore doesn't say, I'm going to get really mad at you, I'm going to go to another country. The oil doesn't go on strike, right? It's there. And so my view is you ought to be taxing these natural resources at 100%. When I say you ought to get 100% of what we call the natural resource rent. That those rents belong to the people. Now, that says, what do we mean by the rent? It's the value of the resource minus the efficient cost of extraction. And everything else ought to go to the people. It seems obvious that ought to be the case. Your previous government attempted to move in that direction. Not surprisingly, those who own those natural resources, I mean, you know, who are making those rents, were not enthusiastic about that particular move.
You get a Nobel Prize in understatement.
But from an economic point of view, it was absolutely the right thing to do. And you should understand that your attempts to do so have really inspired other countries. Even though you might say, you've learned a hard political lesson, Israel had leased its oil and gas fields offshore, to an American company. And I won't say whether there was corruption or not, but at royalties that were unjustifiably low. This is a really interesting case because, not surprisingly, the US government ambassador tried to put pressure on the Israeli government not to renegotiate those. And I had to make some speeches about governments, the US government not intervening in the activities of other countries on behalf of mining companies to embarrass them to back off on that particular effort. The net result of this was that the Israeli parliament passed legislation that basically, you might say, renegotiated the contracts and increased the royalties multiple-fold.
I feel Wayne Swan has something to add to this discussion. Yeah, just pass it. Linda, do you want to pass it? Thanks.
Well, tempting as it is to talk about resource rents, I won't, but the question is a bit related to this, and that is, where do you see the sources of global growth coming from, particularly in the developed world? We know growth will be driven by the developing world, we know it'll be driven by China and Indonesia. But what I see as I move around is that there's a lot of cashed up companies, and they're not using that cash to invest in long-term productivity enhancing, capacity enhancing investments which will drive global growth. A lot of that cash is being used to invest in speculative activity. You know, the London property market, the list goes on. What policies do you see in the developed world that can further encourage these pools of capital to be productively invested for the long term in a job-creating way, rather than diverted, particularly by rent seekers who are seeking to avoid their fair share of tax, particularly, say, in mining? What sort of policies do you think that we need more of in developed countries to make sure that this capital goes to long-term growth-enhancing investments rather than short-term speculative capital gain? You mentioned profit shifting, that's certainly one of them, but there are many others.
Yeah, so let me mention something else that your previous government did right, I thought, but which was not always as politically popular. I think one of the real growth industries is going to be renewable energy. That climate change is a reality, and that we are beginning to appreciate it more and more. And let me say, it's not just global warming, it's weather variability. And the cost of this is enormous. We've recently studied done in the U.S. Originally, in the climate change debate in the United States had some ambivalence because the South in the United States would have suffered a great deal, but Minnesota would have become more livable. And so there was a trade-off, and most people were saying, let the South go, and the really important part of the country would actually be better off. So there was a debate about whether we would benefit from global warming or not. We now realize that that's totally wrong way of phrasing it. The cost to the U.S. of the weather variability has been absolutely enormous. Already. And will get worse. So I think that being ahead of the game is really important. And if you had a carbon price, it would motivate firms to invest, and this, if we had a global carbon price, even more so, to invest in retrofitting the economy. The whole global economy has to be retrofitted to reflect the new scarcity that we hadn't fully appreciated before. So that's one very important area. From the point of view of this is not just new energy creating new electricity generators. We're talking about redesigning our cities. We're talking about redesigning our buildings. It's a really big project that we ought to be engaged in. And that would be an enormous source of demand for investment that would really be, I think, a key provider of growth. So again, it's not that we ought to wait until recovery to begin this agenda. This could be an important part of the recovery agenda, the economic recovery agenda. There are lots of other investments in technology. It is quite striking that I think, going back to a question about technology, we've been drawing down the pool of basic research. If you look at a lot of the innovations, they're really putting into place advances that occurred 20, 30, 40 years ago. The number of take pharmaceuticals, the number of basic new drugs has almost dropped to zero. And you see that, all the old drugs are coming off patent and nothing replacing them, except occasionally an evergreening of an old patent, but not new ideas. So I think in terms of a growth strategy, I think we ought to be investing more in basic research. And you can't tell where that's going to go, but it's very clear in the past that basic research has generated lots of new ideas that have led to new investments.
And that's fine if you're a privately owned company, but companies that are out there that are looking at the share market, they're seeking to pursue strategies which inflate their share price in the short term, which lead them away from the long-term investment strategies that are needed. So what do you think are the policy changes that are required to encourage those people away from their short-term speculative behaviour to long-term investment?
So I think there are two policy changes. One is there are some important changes in corporate governance. And corporate governance now encourages a focus on short-termism. And there are some interesting ideas that some of my colleagues at Columbia have been working on called loyalty shares, where voting rights in corporation are in proportion to how long you hold the shares. If you're a short-term investor, you have relatively little say. If you're a long-term investor, you have a lot more say. So I think that would be a change in governance, corporate governance, which would signal that we believe that long-term investment is really what firms ought to be thinking about, not their quarterly returns. A second thing that would complement that is a financial transactions tax, because much of the activity that goes on in the financial market is a game. When you're betting, whether the stock market is going up, you win, I lose. It's a zero-sum game. It isn't really, all that short-term trading doesn't enhance the productivity of our economy. Now, in the United States, we've taken that to an extreme, and I don't know where Australia is. What? Falling. But this flash trading is, I have argued, I have a paper that I gave at the Federal Reserve in Atlanta, arguing that has negative effects on our economy, not just zero, but negative. Because basically what these flash trading are doing are very sophisticated front running. And what that means is that those who really do the investment in long-term thinking, you know, where's the steel industry going to go? Where is this industry going to go? As soon as they figure it out, the flash traders can get their information, beat them, take out their profits, and so it takes away the profits from people who are trying to think long-term. So that's why I think a financial transaction tax is really important.
Chris, I mean, you're in boardrooms, you're talking to people and trying to, in part, you know, revive some stronger connections there for us. Is there an appetite in parts of business or a growing appetite or awareness in Australia that there's benefits for the economy as a whole, and benefits for shareholders and benefits for owners in a more enlightened version of self-interest for them?
Yeah, I think there is. Obviously, it's patchy. But there are some deep thinkers in the corporate world who, without going through names, who could very well and easily engage in this conversation, whether it be about the tax base and their belief that either individually or in a corporate fashion they should be paying more, or about the importance of innovation and investment in renewable energy and how a market-based mechanism is the right approach for environmental reasons, but also for economic reasons, as Joseph so eloquently outlined. So I do believe that there is some potential there, in the Australian context at least, for that conversation to be had with corporate Australia.
Let me just comment on that. Davos, every year, they do a survey of what are the business leaders think are the major issues. And in recent years, the two top issues have pretty consistently been climate change and inequality. So it's not as if these issues are not part of their mindset. Now, these are mostly European business leaders, not American business leaders. And there is a difference between business leaders in the two, and Australia is somewhere in between, I think. But at least there are a lot of business leaders who really would understand much of what we would say, but they would also say, our hands are tied under the current framework. Sure. I have to do certain things because of, you know, I have a responsibility to my shareholders. If we could change the legal framework, then I would have to behave differently. But under the current framework, we're induced to behave in ways that we think are not in the long-range interest.
Now, under the current framework, I'm induced to behave in a certain way, which is to release you in part to do some other activities in Canberra. But I know that, you know, there's a group of people here who'd love to have a bit of a chance to shake hands and have a cup of tea and have a cookie even.
Okay.
And we've got, if we finish now, we've got a few minutes for people to have the opportunity to do that. I do want to just thank you so much. I mean, it's a real masterclass for us. In part, somewhat reassuring. For those of us who worked in the former government, or for those of us who supported the policies pursued by the former government, and for those of us involved in the revival of the next progressive government in Australia, it gives us some hope that we didn't get it all wrong, which not everyone seems to believe. But also just some really fascinating insights into what's going on in the world and some new thinking. We've got something for you to take home. Some classic Australian children's literature for your grandchildren. I couldn't think of an economic biography that I could give you without embarrassing myself. So instead, you've got a book about Taronga Zoo, a book about an adolescent girl looking for Ella Brandy, a great story about aspiration and education, and Seven Little Australians, which is a story about misrule. So we're just so grateful. Thank you, Chris, as well, and thank you all. And please stay around for a few minutes and introduce yourselves.